23 years of marriage, and my husband David thought he could humiliate me one last time by bringing his secretary to our anniversary dinner. What he didn't know was that I'd been planning this moment for 6 months. While he was choosing the wine, I was choosing my lawyer. While he was making reservations, I was making copies of bank statements. And while he was deciding how to introduce his mistress as a business colleague, I was deciding exactly when to serve him with divorce papers. Spoiler alert, it was right between the tiramisu and his total financial ruin. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Venetian Terrace was David's choice, naturally. He always picked the most expensive restaurant in Scottsdale when he wanted to feel important, and tonight was no exception. 23 years ago, we'd had our first date at a tiny Mexican place downtown where the margaritas cost $5 and the music was too loud. Now here we were, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and waiters who called everyone sir and madam, celebrating what David thought would be just another anniversary dinner where his dutiful wife smiled and pretended everything was perfect. I adjusted the strap of my black dress and checked my watch. Jessica Chen would be arriving in exactly 12 minutes. I knew this because David's assistant had accidentally copied me on the email confirming her reservation at the bar. Poor thing probably thought she was being so clever, booking a separate table and planning to accidentally run into us during cocktails. David had been coaching her on the story for weeks, practicing how she'd approach our table with surprise and delight, explaining how she just happened to be dining alone, and what a wonderful coincidence this was. David reached across the table and took my hand, his wedding ring catching the candlelight. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. He had no idea that the woman sitting across from him had spent the last 6 months becoming someone entirely different. The Emma who used to cry herself to sleep wondering why her husband worked so late was gone. In her place sat a woman who had hired a private investigator, opened her own bank accounts, and learned exactly how much David's car dealership was really worth. "You look beautiful tonight, Em," he said, using the nickname that once made my heart flutter. Now it just sounded hollow, like everything else that came out of his mouth. I know I've been working a lot lately, but this new expansion is going to change everything for us. I smiled, the same smile I'd been perfecting for months. Not too bright, not too knowing. Just the right amount of loving wife mixed with gentle concern. "I'm proud of how hard you work, David. I always have been." He squeezed my hand, probably thinking about how easy this was going to be. How his sweet, trusting wife would welcome Jessica into our conversation, maybe even invite her to join us for dinner. How he could start normalizing her presence in our lives, slowly introducing the idea that she was becoming a close friend. Eventually, when the time was right, he'd sit me down and explain how he'd fallen in love with someone else. But he hoped we could remain friends for the sake of the children. The irony was almost delicious. David thought he was the one with the secret plan. "The kids are doing well," I said, swirling the wine he'd ordered without asking what I preferred. "Tyler's been accepted to 3 colleges already, and Sophie made varsity soccer." "That's great," David replied, though I could see him glancing toward the entrance. "They're good kids. You've done an amazing job with them. You've done an amazing job. Not we've done an amazing job." He'd been separating himself from our family for so long that he didn't even notice when he did it anymore. In David's mind, Tyler and Sophie were my responsibility, just like the house, the bills, and keeping up appearances while he built his new life with a 28-year-old who thought a man with a Porsche and a failing marriage was the height of sophistication. I'd met Jessica exactly once, at the company Christmas party 6 months ago. She was pretty in an obvious way, with long, straight hair and the kind of figure that came from expensive gym memberships and personal trainers. But what struck me most was how young she seemed, not just in years, but in the way she looked at the world. She had that bright-eyed optimism of someone who'd never been truly disappointed, never had to choose between paying the mortgage and fixing the car, never sat in a doctor's office holding a sick child and praying the insurance would cover the treatment. David had introduced her as his right hand, explaining how lost he'd be without her organizational skills. I'd shaken her hand and smiled, even complimented her dress, while mentally cataloging the way David's fingers lingered on her lower back, and how she blushed when he praised her work. It had been so obvious, so painfully cliché, that I almost laughed out loud. That night, I'd gone home and started planning. The first step was hiring Marcus Webb, a private investigator recommended by my friend Linda. Marcus was a former police detective who specialized in marital cases, and he had the kind of quiet competence that made you trust him immediately. Within 2 weeks, he'd confirmed what I already knew and provided me with photos, receipts, and a detailed timeline of David's affair. The hotel bills were particularly damning. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 8 months, David had been checking into the Venetian resort for what he claimed were lunch meetings with potential investors. The credit card statements showed charges for champagne, room service, and spa treatments. Jessica's social media posts, which Marcus had somehow accessed, showed her at the same resort on the same days. Carefully cropped photos that didn't show her companion but revealed enough details to match David's receipts. But I didn't want just evidence of the affair. I wanted to understand everything about David's financial situation, his business dealings, and exactly what I'd be entitled to in a divorce. That's when I hired Jennifer Walsh, a divorce attorney who came highly recommended and charged accordingly. Jennifer was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the sharp-suited shark I'd imagined, she was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a grandmother's manner who happened to be absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting her clients' interests. She'd walked me through every aspect of Arizona's community property laws, explained how David's business would be valued, and helped me understand what my life would look like financially after the marriage ended. The key, Jennifer had told me during our first meeting, is documentation and patience. We need to build an ironclad case, but we also need to be smart about timing. If David thinks you're onto him, he might try to hide assets or manipulate the business valuation. So I'd played the perfect wife while quietly gathering intelligence. I'd smiled and nodded when David explained his late nights, offered to bring him dinner at the office, and even suggested he take a vacation to reduce his stress, all while photographing documents, copying files, and building a case that would leave him with nothing to hide behind. The hardest part hadn't been the deception. It had been watching Tyler and Sophie navigate their father's increasing absence, making excuses for him when he missed soccer games and parent conferences, pretending I didn't know why he was suddenly so interested in business dinners and weekend client events. Tyler, at 16, was old enough to sense something was wrong, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. Sophie, 2 years younger, still believed her father's explanations and got excited when he brought home expensive gifts that I knew were guilt purchases. I'd struggled with whether to tell them what was coming. Part of me wanted to prepare them, to explain that their father's behavior wasn't their fault and that our family was going to change dramatically, but Jennifer had advised against it. Kids can't keep secrets like this, she'd warned. If David suspects you know about the affair, he might take steps to protect himself financially. It's better to present them with a fait accompli. Now, sitting across from David as he checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes, I wondered if I'd made the right choice. In less than 10 minutes, Jessica would walk into this restaurant expecting to play her part in David's carefully orchestrated deception, and I was going to let her, right up until the moment I turned their romantic evening into a legal proceeding. The waiter appeared with our appetizers, and David made a show of tasting the wine and approving it with the kind of exaggerated sophistication that always embarrassed me. He'd grown up in a middle-class family just like I had, but somewhere along the way, he'd started believing his own mythology about being a successful businessman who deserved the finer things in life. "This is nice," he said, cutting into his appetizer with the precision of someone who'd watched too many movies about wealthy people. "We should do this more often." "We should," I agreed, knowing this would be the last dinner we ever shared as husband and wife. It's important to make time for each other. David's phone buzzed, and I watched his face light up as he read what I knew was a text from Jessica confirming her arrival. She was probably in the parking lot right now, checking her makeup and rehearsing her lines, nervous about meeting the wife of the man she was sleeping with, but excited about being part of his sophisticated world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "Business?" I asked, nodding toward his phone. "Just a client," he said, slipping the device back into his pocket. "Nothing important." I smiled and took another sip of wine, savoring the moment. In my purse, folded neatly in a manila envelope, were divorce papers that would freeze David's assets, demand a complete financial disclosure, and request temporary alimony that would leave him scrambling to maintain his lifestyle. Jennifer had filed them this afternoon, but David wouldn't know that until the server delivered them with dessert. Also in my purse was a resignation letter from my job at the nonprofit where I'd worked part-time for the past 5 years. Next, Monday, I'd be starting as a senior marketing director at Robert Kim's consulting firm, a position that came with a salary nearly double what David thought I was capable of earning. Robert, a client from my nonprofit days, had been trying to recruit me for years. When I finally called him 6 weeks ago, he'd practically shouted with excitement. "Emma, I've been waiting for this call for 3 years," he'd said. "When can you start?" The job would give me independence, health insurance, and the kind of financial security that would let me rebuild my life on my own terms. But more than that, it would show Tyler and Sophie that their mother was someone worth respecting. Someone who could take care of them and herself, without needing to depend on a man who'd checked out of their family years ago. David was checking his watch again when I saw her. Jessica had just entered the restaurant, and she was even more beautiful than I remembered. She'd clearly put thought into her outfit, choosing a red dress that was elegant but eye-catching, paired with heels that made her legs look impossibly long. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew she was attractive, and I could see several men at the bar turning to watch her pass. She spotted David immediately, and began walking toward our table with what she probably thought was casual surprise. Her face was perfectly composed, the picture of a young professional who'd unexpectedly encountered her boss at a nice restaurant. But I could see the excitement in her eyes, the thrill of being part of something secret and forbidden. "David?" she said as she approached our table, her voice pitched with just the right amount of surprise. "What a coincidence! I had no idea you'd be here tonight." David stood up with the kind of genuine smile I hadn't seen from him in years. "Jessica, what are you doing here?" "I'm meeting a friend for dinner," she said, glancing at me with what looked like nervous curiosity. "But she's running late, so I was just having a drink at the bar." This was my cue to be the gracious wife, to invite this lovely young woman to join us while we waited for her friend. I was supposed to be charmed by her intelligence, impressed by her dedication to David's business, and completely oblivious to the way they looked at each other. Instead, I smiled and said exactly what David expected me to say. "Why don't you join us? I'd love to hear more about the work you're doing with David." The relief on both their faces was almost comical. Jessica accepted with appropriate reluctance, allowing David to signal the waiter for another chair. As she settled in beside us, I watched David transform into the version of himself he thought was most attractive. The successful businessman, generous with his knowledge and expansive in his stories, the kind of man who deserved to be admired by beautiful young women. "Emma, you should hear about the Henderson account Jessica landed last month," he said, launching into a story I'd heard him practice in the shower. "She walked in there and had them eating out of her hand within 10 minutes. Jessica blushed, prettily and demurred, but I could see how much she enjoyed David's praise. She was young enough to believe that his attention meant something special, that she was different from all the other women who'd passed through his life. She probably imagined herself as the heroine of a romantic story, the young woman who'd awakened passion in a man trapped in a loveless marriage. I asked appropriate questions about her work, complimented her dress, and played the role of the slightly older woman who was impressed by Jessica's ambition and grateful for her dedication to David's success. And all the while, I was watching the clock, counting down to the moment when their perfect evening would explode into something neither of them had planned for. At 8:30, our main courses arrived. David had ordered for all of us without asking, choosing dishes he thought would impress Jessica while demonstrating his sophisticated palate. I ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the surreal experience of having dinner with my husband and his mistress, while they both believed they were deceiving me. Jessica was telling a story about a difficult client when David's hand found hers on the table. It was a brief touch, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but it confirmed everything I needed to know about how far their relationship had progressed. This wasn't just an emotional affair or a workplace flirtation. They were sleeping together, planning a future together, and tonight was probably meant to be another step in their campaign, to convince me that Jessica was just a friend. "You know," David said, turning to me with the kind of smile that once made me weak in the knees. "I've been thinking we should have Jessica over for dinner sometime. Maybe next weekend? I'd love for Tyler and Sophie to meet her." This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the point where David would start integrating Jessica into our family life. Next would come casual mentions of her presence at company events, Then invitations for her to join us at Tyler's baseball games or Sophie's school plays. Slowly, gradually, he'd normalize her presence until it seemed natural for her to be part of our lives, making it easier when he eventually announced that he'd fallen in love with her. "That sounds lovely," I said, meeting Jessica's eyes with genuine warmth. "I'm sure the kids would enjoy meeting you." The waiter appeared to clear our plates and offer dessert menus. David waved him away, claiming we were too full, but I caught the server's attention. "Actually, I think we'd like to see the dessert menu," I said. "And could you bring me the check when you have a moment?" David looked surprised. In 23 years of marriage, I'd never asked for the check at a restaurant. That was his job, his way of demonstrating that he was taking care of his family. But tonight, I wanted to pay for our last meal together. It seemed symbolically appropriate. Don't worry about the check," he said, reaching for his wallet. "This is our anniversary dinner." "I insist," I said firmly. "Consider it my gift to you." Jessica looked confused by the exchange, but David just shrugged and turned his attention back to her. They were deep in conversation about some business crisis when the waiter returned with dessert menus and a leather folder containing our bill. I opened it, added a generous tip, and signed the receipt with a flourish. That's when I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope. "David," I said, placing the envelope on the table between us, "I have something for you." He looked at the envelope with mild curiosity, probably assuming it was some kind of anniversary card or sentimental gesture. Jessica continued talking, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere that I could feel building like electricity before a storm. "What's this?" David asked, picking up the envelope. "Open it," I said simply. He broke the seal and pulled out the legal documents, his face changing, as he recognized what he was looking at. I watched the exact moment when understanding hit him, when his face went from confusion to shock to something that looked almost like fear. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" "Divorce papers," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Filed this afternoon. You've been served." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica had stopped talking mid-sentence, her mouth slightly open as she tried to process what was happening. David stared at the papers in his hands as if they might disappear if he looked at them hard. "Enough." "I don't understand," Jessica said finally, looking between David and me with growing alarm. "What's going on?" I turned to her with the same warm smile I'd been wearing all evening. "I'm divorcing my husband for adultery. And since you're the woman he's been sleeping with for the past 8 months, I thought you should be here when he found out." The color drained from Jessica's face so quickly I thought she might faint. David was still staring at the papers, scanning the legal language that would dismantle his life piece by piece. "How did you—" he started, then stopped, apparently realizing that the how didn't matter anymore. "The Henderson account," I said conversationally, as if we were still discussing business strategies. "The one Jessica supposedly landed last month? The hotel receipts show you were both at the Venetian that day. Same room, champagne, couples massage. Very romantic." Jessica made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. Several nearby tables had begun to notice the tension at our table, conversations quieting as people sensed drama unfolding. "Emma, please," David said, his voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before. "Can we discuss this privately? This isn't the place." "This is exactly the place," I interrupted. "You chose this restaurant. You invited your mistress to our anniversary dinner. You wanted to humiliate me in public, so I thought I'd return the favor." I stood up and gathered my purse, leaving the divorce papers scattered across the table, like confetti. David reached for my arm, but I stepped back smoothly. "The papers explain everything," I said. "Asset freeze, financial discovery, temporary alimony. Your lawyer will receive copies on Monday, along with all the evidence of your affair. The photographs are particularly clear." Jessica was crying now, quiet tears that she was trying to hide behind her napkin. I almost felt sorry for her. She'd thought she was in love with a successful businessman who was trapped in an unhappy marriage. Instead, she'd gotten involved with a man whose business was leveraged to the hilt and whose wife had been 3 steps ahead of him for months. "The house is mine until the court decides otherwise," I continued. I'll be changing the locks tomorrow, so you might want to collect your things tonight. Tyler and Sophie are staying with my sister in Denver until this gets sorted out. That got his attention. You can't take my kids away from me. I didn't take them anywhere, I said. They chose to leave. Apparently they've known about Jessica for longer than you think. Tyler saw you two together at the mall last month, and Sophie found the receipts in your car. They're not angry, David. They're just disappointed. This was the part that hurt most. Watching David realize that his children had lost respect for him. Tyler and Sophie had been packed and ready to go when I picked them up from school that afternoon. They'd hugged me tightly and promised to call every day, but they hadn't asked a single question about their father. I looked around the restaurant, noting the curious stares and whispered conversations. Our drama had become the evening's entertainment for half the dining room, exactly as I'd planned. Enjoy your dessert, I said to both of them. And Jessica, you might want to update your resume. I have a feeling David's business is about to get very complicated. I walked out of the Venetian Terrace with my head high and my heart pounding, leaving behind 23 years of marriage and two people who were just beginning to understand the consequences of their choices. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a few minutes, allowing myself to feel the weight of what I'd just done. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh. How did it go? I typed back, perfectly. See you Monday morning. Tomorrow, I would start my new job and begin building a life that belonged entirely to me. David would wake up to frozen bank accounts and a house he could no longer access. Jessica would probably resign and disappear. Another casualty of a man who thought he could have everything without paying the price. But tonight, driving home through the lights of Phoenix, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of being exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. The real story was just beginning. The first thing I did when I got home was pour myself a glass of the expensive wine David had been saving for a special occasion. If divorcing my cheating husband after 23 years didn't qualify as special, I couldn't imagine what would. The house felt different already, like the air itself had cleared now that the truth was finally out in the open. I sat in my living room, surrounded by the furniture we'd chosen together, the photographs of family vacations that would never happen again, and the carefully curated life that had been slowly suffocating me for years. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I left the restaurant, but I ignored it. David could panic and rage and try to call me as many times as he wanted. The time for conversation had passed. Instead, I called Tyler and Sophie in Denver. My sister Maria answered on the first ring, her voice warm with concern and barely contained excitement. How did it go? She asked immediately. Better than I could have hoped, I said. Is it too late to talk to the kids? They've been waiting. By the phone. Hold on. Tyler's voice came through clear and steady, older than his 16 years. Mom? Did you really serve Dad divorce papers at dinner? I did. Are you okay with that? There was a pause, and I could hear Sophie in the background asking to talk. Mom, we've been talking about it all evening. We're proud of you. We know this wasn't easy. Sophie took the phone next, her voice bright despite the circumstances. Aunt Maria says we can stay here as long as we need to. She's already registered us for school if we want to finish the year here. I felt a wave of gratitude toward my sister, who had dropped everything to take care of my children when I needed to focus on dismantling my marriage. Maria had never liked David, though she'd been diplomatic about it for my sake. Now she was probably celebrating harder than I was. We'll figure out what's best for everyone, I told them. The important thing is that you both know this has nothing to do with you. Your father and I have problems that we should have dealt with years ago. We know, Mom, Tyler said back on the phone. And we know about Jessica, too. We've known for a while. This was the conversation I'd been dreading, but Tyler's voice was matter-of-fact, not angry or hurt. He'd clearly been thinking about this, longer than I'd realized. How long have you known? I asked. Since Christmas. Sophie saw them together at the mall, and then I started paying attention. Dad's not as sneaky as he thinks he is. Sophie took the phone again. We didn't say anything because we didn't want to hurt you, but we also didn't want to pretend everything was normal. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the maturity of my children, and the realization that they'd been protecting me while I thought I was protecting them. I love you both so much, and I promise, no matter what happens with the divorce, our family is going to be stronger than ever. After we hung up, I finally looked at my phone. 17 missed calls from David, 3 from Jessica, and dozens of text messages that ranged from confused to angry to desperate. I deleted them all without reading them. Whatever David wanted to say to me, he could say it through his lawyer. The next morning was Saturday, and I had a locksmith at my house by 8 a.m. David's key would no longer work, and I'd had the garage door codes changed as well. I was boxing up his clothes when he showed up, pounding on the front door like he was trying to break it down. "Emma, open this door. We need to talk." I continued folding his shirts, taking my time with each one. He could shout all he wanted. The neighbors had already gotten quite an education about David Rodriguez's character, and I doubted they'd be sympathetic to his plight. "Emma, please, this is my house too." Actually, it wasn't. The house was in my name only, purchased with money from my father's life insurance policy after he died 5 years ago. David had wanted to put both our names on the deed, but I'd insisted on keeping it separate. One of the few financial decisions I'd made that he hadn't been able to override. At the time, I'd told him it was for tax purposes. Now I realized some part of me had been preparing for this day even then. My phone rang, and Jennifer Walsh's name appeared on the screen. "Good morning, Emma. How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," I said, watching David through the window as he tried to peer into the garage. "He's here trying to get into the house." That's not surprising. The asset freeze went into effect at midnight, so he's probably discovering that his credit cards aren't working and his bank accounts are locked. "Has he tried to contact you directly?" "He's been calling and texting since last night, but I haven't responded." "Good. Don't. Everything needs to go through attorneys now. I'll call his lawyer on Monday and explain the situation. In the meantime, document everything. If he becomes threatening or tries to force his way into the house, call the police." As if on cue, David began pounding on the door again, shouting about his rights and demanding to know what I'd done to his accounts. "Should I call them now?" I asked Jennifer. "Use your judgment. If you feel unsafe, absolutely. But from a legal standpoint, it might be better to let him make a fool of himself in front of the neighbors. Just make sure you're recording everything." I hung up and started my phone's voice recording app, then opened the front door with the chain still attached. David's face appeared in the narrow gap, flushed with anger and desperation. "What did you do to my credit cards?" he demanded. "I can't access any of my accounts. That would be the asset freeze," I said calmly. "It's all explained in the divorce papers. You might want to call a lawyer." "This is insane. You can't just lock me out of my own money." "It's not your money, David. It's our money, and until the court decides how to divide it, nobody gets to spend it. Those are the rules." He tried to push against the door, but the chain held. "Let me in, Emma. We can work this out." "We're way past working things out. You should probably go find somewhere else to stay. I hear the Venetian has nice rooms, though you might have trouble paying for one right now." The reference to his affair hit home, and David's face darkened. "This isn't over." "You're right," I agreed. "It's just beginning. Now please leave my property before I call the police." I closed the door and watched through the window as he stood there for another few minutes, clearly trying to decide what to do next. Finally, he got in his car and drove away, probably heading to his dealership to figure out how to access business accounts that were now frozen, pending a complete financial audit. The rest of the weekend passed in a strange calm. I finished packing David's belongings, cleaned the house from top to bottom, and started making lists of everything I wanted to accomplish in the coming weeks. The silence felt good, like I could finally hear my own thoughts without the constant background noise of managing David's emotions and expectations. Sunday evening, Linda Thompson knocked on my door with a bottle of wine and a grim expression. Linda had been my closest friend in the neighborhood for years, the kind of woman who noticed everything and had no patience for foolishness. "I heard about Friday night," she said, settling into my kitchen with the familiarity of someone who'd been having coffee at my table for a decade. "The whole neighborhood's talking about it." I figured they would be. Linda studied my face with the intensity of a woman who'd raised 4 children and could spot deception from a mile away. "You don't look like someone whose marriage just imploded. You look like someone who just won the lottery. I laughed, surprising myself with how genuine it sounded. Maybe that's because I feel like I did. How long have you known? About the affair? 6 months? About what kind of man I married? Probably years, but I kept making excuses for him. Linda nodded slowly. I never liked him, you know. Too smooth, too concerned with what other people thought, and the way he talked about you when you weren't around, like you were some kind of burden he had to manage. This was news to me. He talked about me? Nothing dramatic, just little comments here and there. How you didn't understand business, how you worried too much about money, how you'd let yourself go since having kids. Small things, but they added up to a picture of a man who didn't respect his wife. I felt a flash of anger, not at David, but at myself for caring what he'd said about me to neighbors. The old Emma would have been devastated to learn that her husband had been undermining her reputation for years. The new Emma was just glad to be done with him. Well, he won't be talking about me much longer, I said. Linda raised her wineglass in a toast to new beginnings and the end of tolerating mediocre men. We spent the evening going through my plans for the future. I told her about the job with Robert Kim's firm, about Tyler and Sophie's decision to finish the school year in Denver, and about the financial independence I was about to gain through the divorce settlement. What about dating? Linda asked as we finished the bottle of wine. Are you ready to think about meeting someone new? The question caught me off guard. In all my planning and preparation, I hadn't given a single thought to the possibility of another relationship. The idea of trusting someone enough to share my life with them seemed impossibly distant. I think I need to figure out who I am as a single person first, I said. I've been half of a couple since I was 25. I don't even know what I like when I don't have to consider someone else's preferences. Linda smiled. That's probably the healthiest thing I've heard you say in years. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Arizona sunshine that made everything seem possible. I dressed carefully for my first day at Kim Consulting, choosing a navy suit that made me feel professional and confident. The woman looking back at me from the mirror was someone I was still getting used to. Someone who made decisions based on her own judgment, rather than trying to keep peace in her household. Robert Kim's office was in a gleaming building in downtown Phoenix, the kind of place where serious business happened, and people's ideas were valued based on their merit, rather than their gender or marital status. Robert himself was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, his face bright with genuine enthusiasm. Emma, welcome to the team. I've been looking forward to this day for 3 years. He gave me a tour of the office, introducing me to colleagues who seemed genuinely interested in my background and experience. My office had a view of the mountains and enough space for the kind of strategic thinking I'd been craving for years. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Your first project is the Morrison Industries account, Robert explained as we settled in his office with coffee. They're looking to rebrand completely, and they specifically asked for someone with your background in nonprofit messaging. They want to position themselves as a socially conscious company without looking like they're just following trends. I felt a thrill of excitement that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or disapproval. This was work I could sink my teeth into, problems I could solve using skills I'd been developing for years, but never been able to fully utilize. What's the timeline? I asked. 6 months for the complete rebrand, but they want to see initial concepts in 3 weeks. I know it's aggressive, but they're launching a new product line and want everything coordinated. I spent the morning diving into background research, reading analyst reports and consumer surveys, mapping out messaging strategies that would position Morrison Industries as both profitable and principled. It was the kind of complex challenge that required complete focus, and I lost myself in it completely. Around noon, my phone rang with Jennifer Walsh's number. How's the first day at the new job? She asked. Perfect. What's happening with David? His lawyer called this morning. David apparently tried to access the business accounts over the weekend and discovered that they're frozen too. He's claiming that the freeze is interfering with legitimate business operations. I felt a moment of concern. David's dealership employed 43 people, and I didn't want innocent employees to suffer because of our divorce. Is that going to be a problem? Not for you. The court order allows for essential business expenses, but it requires approval from both attorneys and detailed documentation. Basically, David can keep the business running, but he can't make any major financial decisions without oversight. What about Jessica? Jennifer's voice took on a satisfied tone. Funny you should ask. She submitted her resignation this morning, effective immediately. Apparently, she's decided that working for her married lover's car dealership isn't the career move she thought it was. I couldn't help but smile. Jessica was young and pretty, and probably smart enough to realize that being associated with David's business during a messy divorce was not going to advance her professional prospects. She'd cut her losses and moved on, leaving David to deal with the consequences of their affair alone. There's something else, Jennifer continued. David's been calling my office repeatedly, asking if there's any way to stop the divorce proceedings. His lawyer says he wants to try marriage counseling. The suggestion was so absurd that I actually laughed out loud. Marriage counseling? He brought his mistress to our anniversary dinner. That's essentially what I told his attorney. But Emma, you should be prepared for David to try every possible approach to avoid this divorce. He's realizing what it's going to cost him, both financially and in terms of his reputation. Let him try whatever he wants. I'm not changing my mind. After we hung up, I returned to my work with renewed focus. David could scheme and plead and try to manipulate the situation all he wanted. I had a new career to build and a new life to create, and I wasn't going to waste any more energy on his problems. The afternoon flew by as I developed initial concepts for the Morrison Industries campaign. By 5 o'clock, I had 3 distinct messaging strategies outlined and a presentation framework that would let the client see how each approach would work across different media platforms. Robert stopped by my office as I was organizing my notes for the next day. How was day 1? He asked. Exactly what I needed, I said honestly. Thank you for waiting for me to be ready for this. Robert's expression grew serious. Emma, I hope you know that this job isn't charity. You're here because you're the best person for the work, and you're going to earn every dollar of your salary. I've seen what you can do when you're given the resources and respect you deserve. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with professional validation and everything to do with being seen clearly by someone who valued my abilities. For years, David had treated my work as a hobby, something I did to keep busy rather than a legitimate career. Robert understood that I was capable of much more than managing household schedules and organizing charity fundraisers. Driving home through Phoenix traffic, I realized that this was the first Monday in years when I wasn't worried about what mood David would be in when he got home, whether dinner would meet his expectations, or if I'd remembered everything on his constantly changing list of priorities. Instead, I was thinking about messaging strategies and brand positioning, challenges that engaged my mind and paid me appropriately for solving them. The house was exactly as I'd left it that morning, peaceful and organized according to my preferences, rather than someone else's demands. I made myself a simple dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat on my back patio watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. How was your first day at the new job? I typed back, perfect. How was school? Different but good. Denver's nice. Sophie made friends with the girl next door already. The thought of my children, adapting so easily to their new situation, filled me with a mixture of pride and relief. They were resilient and smart, and apparently much more prepared for this change than I'd given them credit for. When do you think we'll come home? Sophie had taken Tyler's phone. I considered the question carefully. When things are settled and we know what home is going to look like. But you two are my priority, always. Whatever we decide, together. We love you, Mom, and we're proud of you for standing up for yourself. I sat on my patio until the stars came out, thinking about the strange turns life could take, and how sometimes the worst things that happened to you turned out to be the best things that could have happened. David's affair had hurt me deeply, but it had also forced me to stop accepting a life that was slowly diminishing me. Tomorrow, I would continue building my new career and working toward a divorce settlement that would give me genuine independence. David would continue trying to find ways to avoid the consequences of his choices, probably growing more desperate as he realized that his careful plans were falling apart. But tonight, sitting in my own space with my own thoughts and my own plans for the future, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete contentment with my own company. I was 48 years old, starting over in almost every aspect of my life, and I had never been more excited about what came next. The woman who had smiled politely while her husband humiliated her was gone. In her place was someone who knew exactly what she was worth and wasn't willing to settle for less than she deserved. And that, I realized, was the real victory. Not the divorce or the money or even the satisfaction of watching David scramble to save face, but the simple fact that I had finally become the person I was always meant to be. The rest was just details. The unraveling. 3 weeks into my new life, David's world began collapsing in ways I hadn't even anticipated. I was at my desk reviewing Morrison Industries' feedback on our initial brand concepts when Jennifer Walsh called with an update that made my coffee taste even better than usual. The forensic accountant finished his preliminary review of David's business records, she said without preamble. "Emma, you're going to want to sit down for this." I was already sitting, but I put down my pen and gave her my full attention. What did he find? "Your husband has been running a very creative bookkeeping operation. The short version is that the dealership should be worth about 3 times what David claimed in his financial disclosure. He's been funneling money through a shell corporation and underreporting income for years." I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Tax evasion? Among other things, the forensic accountant found evidence of kickbacks from suppliers, inflated expense reports, and what appears to be a systematic effort to hide assets from potential creditors. Or in this case, from a potential divorce settlement. This was better than I'd hoped. Not only had David been cheating on me, he'd been cheating on the government and planning to cheat me out of my fair share of the business we'd built together. What happens now? Well, David's attorney is going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with his client about the difference between aggressive tax strategies and federal crimes, and you're looking at a much larger settlement than we originally calculated. After Jennifer hung up, I sat in my office overlooking downtown Phoenix and marveled at how thoroughly David had underestimated me. He'd thought I was the simple housewife who wouldn't ask hard questions about money, wouldn't demand proper documentation, wouldn't think to hire experts who could see through his financial shell games. He'd built his entire deception on the assumption that I was too trusting or too stupid to protect myself. He was learning otherwise. My phone rang again, this time with an unknown number I recognized as David's new cell phone. He'd been calling from different numbers all week, trying to get around the fact that I'd blocked his usual contacts. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message on speaker. "Emma, please, we need to talk. I know you're angry, but this is getting out of hand. My accountant says there might be problems with the IRS, and I need to access my business accounts to fix things. People are asking questions, and if this goes public, it's going to hurt the kids too. Call me back." The desperation in his voice was almost satisfying. Almost. But listening to David try to manipulate me by bringing Tyler and Sophie into his problems just reminded me why I was divorcing him in the first place. Everything was always someone else's responsibility, someone else's fault, someone else's problem to solve. I deleted the voicemail and returned to my work. Morrison Industries had approved our second concept with only minor revisions, which meant we were ahead of schedule and under budget. Robert had already assigned me 2 additional accounts, both companies looking for exactly the kind of strategic messaging I specialized in. For the first time in my adult life, I was being paid what I was worth and recognized for my actual capabilities. My assistant knocked on my door around lunchtime. "Emma, there's a woman here to see you. She says it's personal." I looked up from my computer screen, puzzled. "Did she give her name?" "Jessica Chen. She says she used to work with your husband." I felt my eyebrows rise. This was unexpected. "Send her in." Jessica appeared in my doorway looking nothing like the confident, young woman who'd played her part in David's deception 3 weeks ago. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wasn't wearing makeup, and her clothes suggested someone who'd been sleeping poorly and eating irregularly. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman whose life had been turned upside down by her involvement with a married man. "Emma, I'm sorry to bother you at work," she began, hovering uncertainly in the doorway, "but I really need to talk to you." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please, sit down. Can I get you some coffee or water?" She shook her head and perched on the edge of the chair like she might need to run at any moment. "I wanted To apologize. For everything. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed to say it. I studied her face, trying to read what had brought her to my office. Jessica was young enough that this was probably her first experience with real consequences. Her first time realizing that actions had ripple effects that extended far beyond her immediate wants and needs. Apology accepted, I said simply. Is that why you came here? Jessica's composure cracked slightly. I also wanted to warn you about something. David's been calling me constantly since that night at the restaurant. He wants me to lie for him. This got my attention. Lie about what? About the affair. He wants me to sign a statement saying that nothing physical happened between us, that we were just friends and business colleagues. He's saying that if I don't cooperate, he'll make sure I never get another job in Phoenix. I felt a surge of anger at David's predictable attempt to rewrite history. Of course he would try to intimidate Jessica into helping him minimize the affair. It was exactly the kind of cowardly manipulation I'd watched him use for years whenever he was caught in wrongdoing. What did you tell him? Jessica met my eyes for the first time since entering my office. I told him no. What we did was wrong, and I'm not going to make it worse by lying about it. But Emma, he's not giving up. He's desperate, and I think he might try to hurt both of us if he can't find another way out of this. I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. David had always been manipulative, but he'd never struck me as someone who would resort to actual threats. On the other hand, he'd never faced the complete destruction of his carefully constructed life before. Has he threatened you directly? I asked. Not in so many words, but he's been driving by my apartment at all hours, showing up at places where he knows I'll be. Yesterday he cornered me in the grocery store parking lot and got really aggressive when I wouldn't talk to him. I reached for my phone. Jessica, you need to document all of this. File a police report, get a restraining order if necessary. And you should probably talk to my attorney about whether David's behavior constitutes witness intimidation. Jessica looked surprised. You'd help me with that? After what I did to your marriage? The question revealed how young she really was, how little she understood about the dynamics that had destroyed my relationship with David. You didn't ruin my marriage, Jessica. David did that years before he met you. You were just the catalyst that forced me to face the truth about who I married. Tears started flowing down Jessica's cheeks, and I handed her a box of tissues from my desk. I really thought he loved me, she said quietly. I know that sounds naive, but he made me feel like I was special, like I was the missing piece in his life. David's very good at making people feel special, I said gently. It's one of his most dangerous talents. But the man who made you feel cherished is the same man who's now trying to intimidate you into lying for him. That tells you everything you need to know about his character. Jessica wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. What should I do? I wrote down Jennifer Walsh's contact information on a piece of paper. Call my attorney. Tell her everything David has said and done since the divorce was filed. She'll help you figure out the best way to protect yourself. After Jessica left, I sat in my office thinking about the patterns that had defined my marriage for so long. David's response to being caught cheating was exactly what I should have expected. Deny, minimize, blame others, and when all else failed, try to bully people into helping him avoid consequences. He'd used variations of these tactics throughout our relationship whenever he was confronted with behavior he couldn't justify. The difference now was that I wasn't going to enable his avoidance anymore. Neither, apparently, was Jessica. Whatever romantic illusions she'd harbored about David had been thoroughly shattered by his post-divorce behavior. My phone rang with Robert Kim's extension. Emma, can you come to my office? There's someone here I'd like you to meet. I found Robert with a woman about my age who radiated the kind of confidence that came from running her own business successfully. She stood up when I entered and extended her hand with a firm grip. Emma Rodriguez? I'm Patricia Chen, CEO of Chen Technologies. I've been hearing wonderful things about your work on the Morrison Industries campaign. The name caught my attention immediately. Chen? Are you related to Jessica Chen? Patricia's expression darkened slightly. Jessica is my daughter. She told me about the situation with your husband and asked me to speak with you. I felt the pieces clicking into place. Jessica hadn't just lost a job and a boyfriend when my marriage imploded. She'd also had to explain to her successful, no-nonsense mother why she'd gotten involved with a married man and was now being harassed by her former lover. I wanted to apologize for my daughter's role in your personal situation, Patricia continued. But I also wanted to discuss a business proposition with you. Robert gestured for us all to sit down. Patricia's company is looking for a strategic communications partner for a major product launch. When she mentioned that her daughter had worked for your ex-husband's dealership, I thought there might be an opportunity for us to help each other. Patricia opened a sleek portfolio and pulled out a presentation folder. Chen Technologies is launching a new software platform for automotive dealerships. It's designed to streamline inventory management, customer relations, and financial reporting. We're looking for someone who understands both the technology sector and the automotive industry. I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. And you thought my experience being married to a car dealer might be relevant? Among other qualifications, yes. But Emma, there's something else you should know. Our software is designed to prevent exactly the kind of financial irregularities that your forensic accountant discovered in your husband's books. We're positioning it as a tool for transparency and accountability in an industry that hasn't always prioritized either. The irony was delicious. David's business practices were so problematic that they'd inspired the development of software specifically designed to prevent his kind of fraud. And now his ex-wife was being offered the opportunity to market that software to other dealerships. What kind of timeline are we looking at? I asked. Robert leaned forward with obvious enthusiasm. 6-month campaign, starting next quarter. It would be a significant account for us, and Patricia specifically requested you as the lead strategist. Patricia nodded. I've done my research on your background, Emma. Your nonprofit experience gives you credibility when talking about ethical business practices, and your personal situation means you understand the real-world consequences of financial misconduct. Plus, Jessica tells me you handled a very difficult situation with remarkable grace and intelligence. We spent the next hour discussing campaign strategies, target markets, and messaging approaches. Patricia's software was genuinely innovative, and I could see multiple ways to position it that would appeal to dealership owners who wanted to protect themselves from regulatory problems or internal theft. By the time our meeting ended, I had another major account, and Patricia had the marketing partner she wanted. We shook hands on a preliminary agreement, with contracts to be finalized by the end of the week. There's one more thing, Patricia said as we were wrapping up. Jessica wanted me to tell you that she's filing a police report about your ex-husband's harassment. She's also planning to leave Phoenix for a while, just until things settle down. I felt a pang of sympathy for the young woman who'd gotten caught up in David's manipulations. She doesn't have to leave town because of him. No. But she wants a fresh start somewhere that doesn't remind her of the mistakes she made. I have a friend who runs a marketing firm in Seattle. Jessica will have a good job and a chance to rebuild her reputation away from all this drama. After Patricia left, Robert and I spent another hour planning how to integrate the Chen Technologies account with my existing workload. The Morrison Industries campaign was wrapping up ahead of schedule, which would free me to focus on developing messaging for Patricia's software platform. Emma, Robert said as we finished our planning session, I hope you realize what's happening here. In 3 weeks, you've gone from being an underemployed nonprofit worker to being one of the most sought-after strategic communications consultants in Phoenix. Patricia Chen didn't just want our firm for this account. She specifically wanted you. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with professional success and everything to do with being recognized for my actual abilities. For years, David had treated my work as a hobby, something I did to keep busy, rather than a legitimate career. Now, I was being recruited by successful business owners who valued my expertise and were willing to pay accordingly. Driving home that evening, I thought about the conversation with Jessica and what it revealed about David's current state of mind. He was obviously feeling cornered, probably realizing that his financial schemes were about to be exposed and that he had no one left to manipulate into helping him avoid the consequences. But instead of taking responsibility for his choices and trying to minimize the damage, he was doubling down on the same tactics that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. He was trying to intimidate Jessica, probably planning to blame me for his business problems, and almost certainly working on new schemes to hide assets or avoid accountability. It was exactly what I should have expected from a man who'd spent 23 years avoiding responsibility for his actions. My phone was ringing when I walked into my house. Tyler's number appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart. How was school?" "Good. But Mom, I need to tell you something. Dad called me today." I felt my stomach tighten. David wasn't supposed to contact the children directly while they were staying with Maria. All communication was supposed to go through me or my attorney. What did he say? He wanted to know when Sophie and I were coming home, and he kept asking questions about you. Like whether you seemed happy, whether you were dating anyone, stuff like that. He also asked if we thought you'd be willing to work things out with him. I sat down heavily on my couch. David was now trying to use our children to gather intelligence about my state of mind and my plans for the future. It was a new low, even for him. What did you tell him? That he should talk to you directly if he wanted to know how you were doing. Mom, he sounded really weird. Kind of frantic, like he was scared about something. Tyler was perceptive enough to recognize that his father was in some kind of serious trouble. I made a mental note to call Jennifer Walsh and report the inappropriate contact with the children. Did he say anything else? He kept talking about how this was all a big misunderstanding, and how much he missed our family. But Mom, if he missed us so much, why did he cheat on you? Why did he bring that woman to your anniversary dinner? The pain in Tyler's voice made my heart ache. At 16, he was old enough to understand that his father's behavior didn't match his words, but still young enough to hope that somehow the family he'd grown up in could be repaired. Sometimes people make choices that hurt the people they love, I said carefully. Your father's problems with me don't change how much he loves you and Sophie. But they change how much we respect him, Tyler said quietly. Sophie and I have been talking about it a lot. We don't want to live with him anymore, Mom. Even after the divorce is final, we want to stay with you. Relief flooded through me. I'd been worried that David would try to turn the children against me, or that they'd blame me for breaking up the family. Instead, they were making their own judgments about their father's character and choosing to align themselves with the parent who'd been honest with them. That's your choice to make, I told him. But you should know that no matter what you decide, I'll support your relationship with your father. He's not a good husband, but he can still be a good father if he chooses to be. After we hung up, I called Jennifer Walsh and reported David's contact with Tyler. She made notes about the inappropriate communication and promised to send a formal warning to David's attorney. Emma, I think we need to start preparing for David to escalate his behavior, she said. Men like him often become more dangerous when they realize they're losing control of the situation. Between the financial investigation, Jessica's refusal to cooperate with his lies, and now his children choosing to live with you, he's probably feeling desperate. I thought about Jessica's description of David's increasingly erratic behavior and felt a chill of genuine concern. What kind of escalation are you talking about? Hard to say. He might try to turn public opinion against you, spread rumors about your character or your fitness as a mother. He might attempt to sabotage your new job or interfere with your other relationships, or he might try more direct intimidation. Should I be worried about my safety? Jennifer was quiet for a moment. I think you should be careful. Install security cameras. Vary your routines. Let people know where you're going and when you expect to be back. And if David shows up at your house or workplace uninvited, call the police immediately. That night, I installed a security system that would alert me to any movement on my property and automatically record anyone who approached my doors or windows. I also programmed emergency numbers into my phone and made sure my neighbors had my contact information. I wasn't afraid of David exactly, but I wasn't naive enough to assume that a man who'd built his life on deception and manipulation would simply accept defeat gracefully. He'd already shown that he was willing to harass Jessica and involve our children in his schemes. There was no telling what he might try next. But whatever David was planning, I would be ready for it. I'd spent months preparing for this battle, and I wasn't going to let his desperation undo everything I'd worked to achieve. My new life was too important, my independence too precious, and my children's respect too valuable to risk by backing down now. David had started this war when he decided to betray our marriage. Now he was going to learn what it meant to fight someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by winning. The desperation gambit. David's next move came exactly 1 month after I'd served him divorce papers at the Venetian Terrace, and it was so predictably desperate that I almost felt embarrassed for him. I was in my office reviewing final presentations for the Chen Technologies campaign when my assistant buzzed me with unusual urgency. "Emma, there are 2 men here from the Arizona Department of Child Safety. They say they need to speak with you about a report that was filed." My blood went cold. There was only one person who would have called Child Protective Services on me, and only one reason he would have done it. David was trying to use the nuclear option, attempting to paint me as an unfit mother to gain leverage in our custody dispute. I walked to the reception area where 2 caseworkers were waiting, both carrying clipboards and wearing the kind of serious expressions that suggested they'd heard some disturbing allegations. The older man introduced himself as Mark Stevens, and his partner was a woman named Carol Martinez who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we need to discuss a report that was filed regarding the welfare of your children, Tyler and Sophie Rodriguez," Mark began in the careful, neutral tone that social workers used when they weren't sure what they were walking into. "Of course," I said, maintaining my composure despite the rage building in my chest. "Would you like to speak in my office, or would you prefer somewhere more private?" Carol glanced around the professional office environment, taking in the corporate setting and my business attire. "Your office will be fine." Once we were seated, Mark opened his folder and consulted his notes. "We received a report alleging that you've abandoned your children in another state while pursuing an extramarital affair. The caller also suggested that you've been drinking heavily and making erratic decisions that put your children at risk." I felt my jaw clench, but I kept my voice steady. "And who filed this report?" The caller identified himself as David Rodriguez, the children's father. He expressed concern about their welfare and requested an immediate welfare check. Carol was studying my face carefully, probably looking for signs of substance abuse or emotional instability. Instead, she was seeing a composed professional in a well-appointed office, which was clearly not what she'd expected based on the allegations. "I see," I said calmly. "Well, let me address those concerns directly. My children are currently staying with my sister Maria Gonzalez in Denver, while I establish my new living situation following my divorce from their father. They're enrolled in school there and are in regular contact with me. Would you like to speak with them directly?" Mark looked surprised. "You'd be willing to arrange that?" "Of course. Tyler is 16 and Sophie is 14. They're certainly old enough to speak for themselves about their living situation and their relationship with both parents." I pulled out my phone and dialed Tyler's number, putting the call on speaker. He answered on the second ring, his voice bright and cheerful. "Hi, Mom. How's work going?" "Hi, sweetheart. I have 2 people from Arizona Child Protective Services here who'd like to ask you some questions about how you and Sophie are doing in Denver. Is that okay?" There was a pause, and I could hear Tyler processing this information. "Child Services? Why would they be calling?" Mark leaned forward. "Tyler, this is Mark Stevens from DCS. Your father filed a report expressing concern about your welfare. Can you tell me about your current living situation?" Tyler's voice hardened in a way that made him sound much older than 16. "My father called you guys? That's ridiculous. Sophie and I are staying with our Aunt Maria because our parents are getting divorced, and we didn't want to be in the middle of their legal stuff. We're doing great here." Carol took over the questioning. "Are you in school? Are your needs being met?" "Yes, ma'am. Aunt Maria enrolled us at the local high school, and we're both doing well academically. She takes great care of us, and we talk to our mom every day. Our mom didn't abandon us. We chose to come here because we didn't want to live with our dad anymore." Mark and Carol exchanged glances. This was clearly not the scenario they'd been prepared for based on David's report. "Why don't you want to live with your father?" Carol asked gently. Tyler was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him deciding how much to share. "Because he cheated on our mom for months, lied to our whole family, and then tried to humiliate her in public. Sophie and I lost respect for him, and we don't trust him anymore." "Is Sophie there? Could we speak with her as well?" Mark asked. "Sophie," Tyler called. "Mom's on the phone with some people from Child Services. Dad called them." I heard Sophie's voice in the background, sharp with indignation. "He did what?" Then she was on the phone, her 14-year-old voice carrying all the moral outrage that teenagers could muster when adults behaved badly. "This is Sophie Rodriguez. Are you people seriously here because my father called you? That's so typical. He ruins our family and then tries to make it look like our mom did something wrong." Carol's expression was softening as she listened to my articulate, obviously well-cared-for children defend their living situation and their mother. "Sophie, can you tell me about your daily routine? Are you happy where you are?" "I love it here. Aunt Maria is amazing, and she treats us like we're her own kids. We get up, go to school, do homework, help with chores, and talk to our mom every night. It's actually the most stable our life has been in months because we don't have to watch our parents fight anymore." "And your mother? How would you describe her behavior lately?" Sophie's voice became fierce with loyalty. "My mom is the strongest person I know. She worked 3 jobs to take care of us while our dad was off with his girlfriend, and now she's got this amazing new career and she's building a life that doesn't depend on anyone else. I want to be exactly like her when I grow up." After the soirée, we ended the call. Mark and Carol sat in my office looking slightly stunned. The report they'd received painted a picture of an unstable woman who'd abandoned her children to pursue selfish interests. Instead, they'd found a successful professional whose mature, well-spoken children had chosen to live with a relative while their parents' marriage ended. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Mark said finally, "would you mind if we contacted your sister to verify the children's living arrangements?" "Please do." I wrote down Maria's contact information. "She's a nurse at Denver General Hospital. She's been incredibly generous in taking care of Tyler and Sophie during this difficult time." Carol was making notes in her file. "Can you tell us about your relationship with your ex-husband? Has there been any history of domestic violence or substance abuse?" I thought carefully about how to answer. I wanted to be honest without appearing vindictive. "David has never been physically abusive, but he's been psychologically manipulative throughout our marriage. He's currently facing some serious legal and financial problems related to our divorce, and I believe he's becoming increasingly desperate to find ways to shift blame and create leverage." "What kind of legal problems?" Mark asked. "Tax evasion, asset concealment, and business fraud, according to the forensic accountant who reviewed his records. He's also been harassing his former girlfriend, who's filed police reports about his behavior." The 2 caseworkers exchanged another look. David's credibility as a concerned parent was evaporating rapidly. "Mrs. Rodriguez, based on what we've seen and heard today, we're going to close this case," Carol said. "Your children are clearly safe and well cared for, and they've expressed their preferences about their living situation clearly. We'll make a note in our system that this appears to have been a harassment complaint rather than a legitimate welfare concern." After they left, I sat in my office feeling a mixture of relief and fury. David had tried to use the child welfare system as a weapon against me, potentially traumatizing Tyler and Sophie in the process. It was a new low, even for him, and it confirmed everything I'd suspected about his current state of mind. I called Jennifer Walsh immediately. "He called child services on you?" Jennifer's voice was sharp with anger. "Emma, this changes things significantly. Using false allegations about child welfare as a divorce tactic is not just unethical, it's illegal. We can file harassment charges and request sanctions against him." "Do it," I said without hesitation. "I'm done being patient with David's escalating behavior." "There's something else you should know," Jennifer continued. "The IRS contacted my office this morning. They're opening a formal investigation into David's business practices based on our forensic accountant's findings. This isn't just a civil matter anymore. David could be facing criminal charges." I felt a grim satisfaction at this news. David's financial schemes were finally catching up with him in ways that couldn't be avoided through manipulation or charm. The federal government didn't care about his sob stories or his claims that his ex-wife was being vindictive. What does that mean for our divorce proceedings? It actually strengthens our position significantly. The court will be very interested in any criminal conduct that affects marital assets. But Emma, it also means David is going to become even more desperate. Men facing federal prosecution sometimes do very unpredictable things. That afternoon, I left work early to install additional security measures at my house. I added motion sensor lights around the property, upgraded my alarm system, and installed cameras that would send alerts directly to my phone if anyone approached the doors or windows. I also called Linda Thompson and asked her to keep an eye on my house when I wasn't home. Of course, Linda said immediately. But Emma, what's going on? You sound worried. I explained about the child services visit and David's increasingly erratic behavior. Linda listened with growing concern, then made a suggestion that surprised me. Why don't you stay at my place for a few days? Just until things calm down. I have plenty of room, and frankly, I'd feel better knowing you're not alone right now. I was touched by her offer, but I wasn't ready to be driven from my own home by David's intimidation tactics. I appreciate that, but I think I'll be okay. The security system should be enough. That evening, I was making dinner when my phone rang with an unknown local number. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message back. Emma, this is Patricia Rodriguez. David's mother's voice was strained and formal. I need to speak with you about David and the children. Please call me back. I hadn't spoken to Patricia since the divorce was filed. She'd always been polite to me, but distant. The kind of mother-in-law who clearly thought her son could have done better but was too well-mannered to say so directly. I was curious about what had prompted her to reach out now. I called her back, and she answered immediately. Emma, thank you for calling. I wanted you to know that David came to see me today, and I'm very concerned about his state of mind. This was unexpected. Patricia had always defended David's behavior, making excuses for his selfishness and minimizing his faults. For her to express concern about her son suggested that his behavior had become impossible to ignore. What happened? He was ranting about you and the divorce, making all sorts of wild accusations. He claims you've been planning this for years, that you've been stealing money from his business, that you're trying to turn Tyler and Sophie against him. Emma, none of what he was saying made any sense. I felt a chill of recognition. David was beginning to construct an alternate reality where he was the victim of my elaborate scheme rather than the architect of his own downfall. It was a dangerous sign, suggesting that he was losing his grip on what was actually happening. Did he say anything specific about his plans? Patricia was quiet for a moment. He kept talking about how he was going to fix everything and make you pay for what you've done. Emma, I've never seen him like this. He was almost manic, talking very fast and not making much sense. I think he might be having some kind of breakdown. Patricia, I think you should know that David called Child Protective Services on me today, making false allegations about my fitness as a mother. I heard her sharp intake of breath. He didn't. Emma, please tell me he didn't actually do that. He did. The caseworkers came to my office this afternoon. Fortunately, Tyler and Sophie were able to speak for themselves about their living situation, so the case was closed immediately. I'm so sorry, Patricia said, her voice heavy with shame. I raised him better than this. I don't know what's happened to him, but this isn't the son I thought I knew. It was the first time in 23 years that Patricia had acknowledged that David's behavior was inappropriate. I felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for her. She was probably just beginning to realize that the son she'd protected and defended for decades wasn't the man she'd believed him to be. Patricia, I'm not trying to hurt David or take revenge on him. I just want a fair divorce settlement and to protect my children from being used as weapons in this process. I understand that now. Emma, is there anything I can do? Any way I can help fix this mess? I considered her offer carefully. Patricia still had influence over David, and she was one of the few people he might listen to if she confronted him about his behavior. You could talk to him about getting professional help. He's facing serious legal problems, and his current behavior is only making things worse for everyone, including himself. I'll try, she said. But Emma, please be careful. I'm worried about what he might do next. After we hung up, I realized that even David's own mother was now concerned about his potential for dangerous behavior. That was perhaps the most alarming development yet. I called Tyler and Sophie to check in and let them know about the conversation with their grandmother. Tyler listened thoughtfully, then asked a question that showed how much he'd matured in the past month. Mom, do you think Dad might try to hurt you? I didn't want to lie to him, but I also didn't want to frighten him unnecessarily. I think your father is scared and angry, and people sometimes make poor decisions when they feel cornered. But I'm being careful, and I have security measures in place. Maybe Sophie and I should come home, Tyler said. We could help watch out for you. The protectiveness in his voice made my heart ache. My 16-year-old son was ready to put himself between me and his father if necessary. No, sweetheart. You and Sophie are exactly where you need to be. Right now. The best thing you can do for me is stay safe and focus on school. That night, I lay in bed listening to every sound the house made, hyper-aware of my surroundings in a way I'd never been before. The security system was armed, my phone was charged and within reach, and I'd left lights on throughout the house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that David was out there somewhere, planning his next move. I thought about the conversation with Patricia and what it revealed about David's mental state. He'd always been someone who needed to control the narrative, to be seen as the successful businessman and devoted family man. Now that facade was crumbling, his business was under federal investigation, his children had chosen to live elsewhere, and his ex-wife was thriving without him. For a man whose identity was built on being admired and needed, the current situation had to be devastating. But instead of accepting responsibility and trying to rebuild his life, he was doubling down on denial and blame. He was constructing a fantasy where I was the villain and he was the victim, which meant he could justify almost any behavior as self-defense. It was a dangerous mindset, and I was beginning to realize that the David I'd been married to for 23 years might not exist anymore. In his place was someone desperate enough to file false child abuse reports and unstable enough to worry. His own mother. I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m, exhausted by vigilance and adrenaline. But even in sleep, I remained alert to sounds that might signal danger approaching. The next morning brought news that would change everything yet again. Jennifer Walsh called before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, her voice tight with urgency. "Emma, we have a problem. David didn't just call child services on you. He's filed a lawsuit against you personally, claiming that you destroyed his business through malicious interference, and that you're not entitled to any portion of his assets because you contributed to their devaluation." I sat down heavily at my kitchen table. Can he do that? He can file it, but it's completely frivolous. In fact, it's so clearly retaliatory that the judge is likely to sanction him for filing a bad faith lawsuit. But Emma, this tells us something important about David's strategy. He's not trying to win anymore. He's trying to destroy you financially and emotionally, even if it costs him everything in the process. What does that mean for me? It means we're dealing with someone who's moved beyond rational self-interest. David would rather burn everything down than accept that he's lost. And that makes him very dangerous indeed. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the careful, strategic woman who had planned David's downfall was going to have to become someone even stronger and more determined. Because the man I'd been married to for 23 years was gone, replaced by someone who had nothing left to lose and apparently no limits on what he was willing to do to avoid accepting responsibility for his choices. The war I'd started with divorce papers was about to become something much more serious, and I had to be ready for whatever David tried next. The final reckoning. 6 months after I served David divorce papers at the Venetian Terrace, federal agents arrested him at his dealership on charges of tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. I was in my office at Kim Consulting, reviewing quarterly projections that showed my income had tripled since the divorce, when Jennifer Walsh called with the news. "It's over, Emma," she said simply. "David won't be challenging the divorce settlement." From federal prison, I leaned back in my chair, feeling an unexpected sense of closure rather than satisfaction. The man who had tried to humiliate me with his mistress, who had filed false child abuse reports and frivolous lawsuits, who had threatened everyone from Jessica to his own children, was finally facing consequences he couldn't manipulate or charm his way out of. The divorce settlement was finalized 2 weeks later. I received the house, half of David's legitimate business assets, and enough spousal support to ensure Tyler and Sophie's college education was fully funded. More importantly, I had full custody of the children, who had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with their father's destructive choices. Tyler and Sophie returned to Phoenix that summer, moving into the house I'd renovated to reflect our new life. Gone were the expensive furnishings David had chosen to impress visitors, replaced with comfortable pieces that actually suited our family's needs. The house felt like home in a way it never had during my marriage. On a warm evening in August, exactly 1 year after David had brought Jessica to our anniversary dinner, I hosted a celebration of my own. Tyler had just started his senior year with a full scholarship to Arizona State already secured. Sophie was thriving in high school, captain of the soccer team and president of the Student Environmental Club. My sister Maria had flown in from Denver, along with my mother who hadn't stopped smiling since David's arrest. Patricia Rodriguez came too, carrying a bottle of wine and an apology she'd been crafting for months. David's mother had spent the year coming to terms with who her son really was, and she'd become an unexpected ally in helping Tyler and Sophie process their father's betrayal. "I keep thinking about all the signs I ignored," Patricia said as we sat on my back patio watching the sunset. "All the times I made excuses for behavior I knew was wrong." "We all did that," I replied gently. "It's easier to believe someone we love is going through a difficult phase than to accept that they're showing us who they really are." Jessica Chen had sent a card from Seattle, where she was building a successful career in digital marketing and dating a software engineer, her own age. She'd learned the difference between infatuation and genuine partnership, between being someone's secret and being someone's priority. Her mother, Patricia, had become one of my best clients, and the Chen Technologies campaign had won 3 industry awards. But the real celebration was simpler than any of that. Tyler walked across the patio and handed me a glass of lemonade, then settled into the chair beside me with his college textbooks. Sophie was at the piano, playing a piece she'd been working on for months, the notes floating through the open doors like promises of beautiful things to come. "Mom," Sophie said during a pause in her practice, "remember that night when Dad brought that woman to dinner and you gave him the divorce papers?" "I remember. I was so scared that our family was falling apart. But this feels more like a family than we ever were before." I looked around at the people gathered in my backyard, all of us connected by love rather than obligation, by choice rather than expectation. My sister was helping my mother with a crossword puzzle. Patricia was showing Tyler photos from his baby years that David had never bothered to share, and my neighbors Linda and Robert had stopped by with dessert and stories about their own journeys to independence. This was what I'd been fighting for without even realizing it. Not revenge against David, though justice had been satisfying. Not even financial security, though independence had been crucial. I'd been fighting for the right to build a life based on authenticity rather than performance, surrounded by people who valued me for who I actually was rather than who they needed me to be. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and for a moment I felt the old anxiety spike. But it was just a former colleague congratulating me on a promotion that had been announced that afternoon. I was now Kim Consulting's director of strategic communications, with my own team and the kind of salary I'd never imagined earning. David was serving a 5-year sentence at a minimum security facility in Arizona, where he was apparently teaching business classes to other inmates and maintaining his belief that he'd been the victim of an overzealous prosecution. I'd heard from Patricia that he still didn't understand why his children refused his phone calls or why his ex-wife had been able to rebuild her life so successfully without him. But understanding wasn't required for justice. The man who had tried to control and diminish me for decades was finally experiencing the consequences of his choices, while the woman he'd underestimated was thriving in ways he'd never thought possible. As the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, Tyler caught my attention with a question that showed how much he'd matured over the past year. "Mom, do you ever regret staying married to Dad for so long?" I considered his question, carefully, watching Sophie pack up her sheet music and Patricia hugging my mother goodbye. "I regret the time I wasted trying to fix something that couldn't be repaired. But I don't regret the experience, because it taught me what I was willing to accept and what I wasn't, and it gave me you and Sophie, which makes everything else worthwhile." "Are you ever going to date again?" Sophie asked with the directness that only teenagers could manage. I laughed, realizing I'd started thinking about that possibility. "Recently. Maybe someday, when I meet someone who adds to my life instead of complicating it." That night, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were cleaned and the house was quiet, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and thought about the journey that had brought me here. A year ago, I'd been a woman trapped in a marriage that was slowly destroying her sense of self. Tonight, I was someone who knew exactly what she was worth and refused to settle for less. The divorce papers I'd served with dessert had been more than just a legal document. They'd been a declaration of independence, a refusal to accept humiliation as the price of keeping peace, and ultimately, the first step toward becoming the person I was always meant to be. David had thought he could have everything without consequences, could humiliate me in public and face no repercussions. Instead, he'd given me the perfect opportunity to show him exactly what happened when you underestimated Emma Rodriguez. And that, more than any settlement or sentence, was the real victory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.